Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here, and welcome to the first module. Our reading assignment for this week is Chapter 11 in the text. And so before I get into that, let me give you some secrets about reading. So the text can be a little bit dry now and then, and I think all of it's interesting, but if you get really bored during your reading, I get it. So what I want you to do is read through the text the best that you can, but also take advantage of my reading notes because I try to highlight the most important parts of the reading in my reading notes. So one of the little secrets, and I mentioned this in my reading notes about understanding what's going on, is something as simple as looking at the chapter title. And my eyes are going to leave the camera for a little bit as I read through my notes. But, anytime you approach a textbook and anytime you have a reading to do, the first thing you should do is look at the chapter title. And so in this case, our chapter 11 is Crisis and Recovery in Afro-Eurasia between 1300 and 1500. So right away, you know that there was a crisis of some kind, and you can assume there's a recovery of some kind because the title of the chapter is Crisis and Recovery. You also know right away the time frame from 1300 to 1500. So our course starts at 1500 and moves forward in world history, but it's really important to give you some context or some background, especially in the 1300 and 1400s, because the bubonic plague or the Black Death was like the huge deal in world history, and that starts in the late 1300s. And I talk a little bit about how biology can drive history. You know, the bubonic plague is an epidemic, if you will, or a germ, and this occurs long before germ theory was discovered. So back in the 1300s, 1400s, up until the mid-1800s, physicians or people in general had no idea how diseases spread, what caused diseases. They didn't know about germs until much later, until the late 1800s. So think about that for a second. It makes sense when you read about the Black Death and the bubonic plague that since people had no idea of how we got sick, they couldn't even conceive of a germ. They couldn't see anything that small. There were no microscopes. A lot of times they would blame the plague on sin or on religion or on other events, which is what we always do when we don't have explanations for things. We tend to blame events on other things when we don't know the real explanation. So that's the crisis in this chapter, is the bubonic plague or Black Death. And so we know that's the crisis. The recovery part, we know that after, and it really takes about a century or two for population levels to come back, but we know that the recovery is as the plague starts to wane or starts to go away, that population comes back. And also in the process, because all of Europe and all of Asia was in such political turmoil up to that time, the recovery part is really the formation of new nation states, also the spread of Islam. You're going to read about the Ottoman Empire, you're going to read about Persia, you're going to read about Shiites and Sunnis as far as different factions or sects of Islam is concerned. So pay attention to those things. It's interesting. And again, those disputes between Sunnis and Shiite are still going on today. So it's interesting to relate to some of the origins of these religious differences. So that's one big part of the chapter. And the other thing to pay attention to, let me just look through here. There's another thing that's of interest, and I think it's on page 428, and it talks about climate change and the 7 years of really bad drought in Europe. And again, this is not man-made climate change because it's before the Industrial Revolution, but it is something that had a great effect on Europe as far as food production goes. Sometimes they call it, there's a guy named Dante who wrote the Inferno during this time, and sometimes this climate change period is called the Dantean anomaly. So again, you really don't need to know that, but just understand that sometimes environment, just like biology, can greatly affect history, and it's pretty interesting. There's something called the Little Ice Age that follows this, And we may talk about that a little bit later, but it is interesting that history is not always driven by politics or wars. Sometimes it's driven by biology or environmental factors such as volcanoes and earthquakes and disruptions in meteorology or anomalies in meteorology. So check that out. The rest of the chapter is going to talk at length about Europe, so Spain, France, and England, because there's a lot of changes going on during that period of time. I want you to know what the Renaissance is. So on page 433, I think, I'm looking at my notes, it talks about the Renaissance, which is that. It's a renaissance or a renewed interest in humanism, in art, in science, and the human condition. So a lot of the art and architecture that we're used to today really comes right out of the Renaissance. So know what the Renaissance is, that it's this newfound explosion. It really happens in Italy of culture, this new interest in culture and new interest in art. And art tells us a lot about history as well. So when you see the great works of Michelangelo, for example, that's all Renaissance stuff, and you can see this sort of this flourishing of humanism coming out of that time period. There is also a little section on Joan of Arc that's interesting. Under the Renaissance, it's going to talk about the circulation of books, and that's all the text really talks about as far as book publishing is concerned. But I'm a huge Gutenberg fan, and Gutenberg, as I mentioned in the opening video, invents the printing press in the 1440s, and prior to that time, books and information was under the control of the church. It was written out by scribes. After the printing press, information spreads freely, and I think it's a real democratizing event because the spread of knowledge is really important to the flourishing of culture and society. And I think next week we're going to have a little assignment where I'm going to want you to write about Gutenberg. But again, the book doesn't really mention Gutenberg, but I do because I think it's an important part of this world history. And then finally, I want you to know what a primary source is, the difference between a primary source and a secondary source. Again, the book doesn't mention this, but the book has primary sources contained within. A primary source is simply a document, a text, or an artifact that was produced during the time of the history. So if someone's writing about an event or about a war and they were actually there at that time, that's a primary source. A secondary source is something that was written about the time. So a newspaper account, a textbook, those are secondary sources, not primary sources in most cases. You need to know that for the quiz. I recommend that you Google the difference between primary and secondary source if you want to review it. But it's one of those things in history that that's our research. Our research is always primary source research and documents to put a history together. So it's important that you know that. And then finally, what else is going on? Chapter 11, we get into shipbuilding a little bit, and pretty soon, Columbus is going to set sail. So 1492, Columbus and the Spanish head towards the New World, or try to find the New World. Well, they're actually trying to find a shorter route to China, but they run into the New World on the way. So make sure you understand that. We'll talk a little bit about that again in the next chapter. And the great mariners of the day were the Spanish and the Portuguese. You'll read a little bit about the Indian Ocean and trade with China. Pay attention to the maps in the textbook because I think they help you out a lot. That's it for this week. I look forward to seeing you again next week when we tackle Chapter 12. If you have any questions, let me know. Thanks a lot. Have a great day.